What you think you're seeing right now is not the world. It's only the reflection your mind has built from fragments. The light entering your eyes doesn't arrive as a continuous scene. It is broken into impulses, reorganized and retouched before you even notice. The sunset that moves you is not the same as the electromagnetic waves crossing the atmosphere. It's a mental painting, made with brushstrokes that never existed exactly that way in the sky. The sound of your voice, which you believe you hear as a flow, is actually a sequence of cuts and patches that the brain stitches together to make it seem whole. We believe that to observe is to receive the real, but to observe is to create. Every gaze is an act of invisible editing, like a director who chooses angles, cuts scenes, and adds a soundtrack without the viewer realizing it. The world you experience is not a faithful copy. It's an artistic interpretation produced in real time by your own consciousness. If everything you perceive passes through this creative filter, where does the real begin, and where does your touch on it end? Perhaps what we call reality is not something we find, but something we bring into being by looking at it. And if that's the case, the question changes completely. It's no longer what's happening out there, but what am I making exist right now? Most people believe that looking is a neutral act. Light enters the eyes, the brain processes it, and that's it. Reality is before us, but human observation is anything but neutral. The mind is not content to receive raw data. It reorganizes, softens or accentuates, fills gaps, and even invents elements to maintain coherence in the experience. What we call perception is not simply opening a window to the world, but a constant editing process. So automatic it's rarely noticed. Just think about visual illusions. When we see two identical lines appear different because of context, or fixed dots that move when placed over contrasting patterns, we are not facing a rare mistake, but an essential feature of how the brain works. The mind prefers to create meaning rather than accept that something is incomplete or uncertain. This tendency to correct reality is not an exception, it's the rule. Walking down a street, for example, you believe you see all the details around you. In truth, you're registering only small portions of the scene, while your brain reconstructs the rest from memories, expectations, and learned patterns. Shadows are not seen as they are, but as we suppose they should be. Faces are recognized in milliseconds before we even capture their details. This speed is useful, but it comes at a cost. We see far less than we believe we see. This filtering begins at the most basic sensory level. The eyes, for instance, do not capture the entire range of light frequencies, only a narrow band of the electromagnetic spectrum. The same goes for hearing. We detect only a limited range of sound frequencies. Most of what exists lies outside sensory reach. But even within what we can capture, the brain acts as an editor, deciding what enters and what stays out of the final version. The reason for this selection is not malice, but survival. Processing every detail in raw form would be unbearable and slow. So, the mind simplifies, creates shortcuts, and builds a functional reality so we can act quickly. But functionality does not guarantee truth. Often, it sacrifices accuracy in exchange for efficiency. A striking example is found in so-called selective blindness. When focused on a specific task, we may fail to notice glaring changes around us. In famous experiments, people don't notice that someone has changed clothes or that an object has disappeared from a scene, even while looking directly at the spot. The attentional filter works like a gate. Only what's deemed relevant in the moment gets through, and what's relevant is not decided by the world, but by the observer's internal state. This editing is not limited to vision. The same logic applies to hearing. We can hold a conversation in a noisy cafe and isolate a single voice as if the rest vanished. In reality, all the sound reaches our ears, but the brain mentally dampens or erases what it deems unimportant. We perceive less of the real and more of a narrative tailored to our intention. When we understand this, the very idea of seeing the world as it is begins to falter. There is no completely raw point of view, free from internal interference. Even when we try to just observe, we are already applying filters, because interpretation is not optional. It is embedded in the very mechanism of perception. The challenge, then, is not to eliminate filters, that's impossible, but to recognize them. When you realize that what you see is, in part, what your mind creates, the possibility opens up to change the way you look. And by changing the observation, you also change the experience of reality. This is where the practice of conscious observation gains strength, not as an attempt to reach an impossible purity, but as a fine adjustment of the inner lens to reveal layers that normally go unnoticed. The next step is to understand that this reconstruction is not only psychological, but deeply rooted in neurological and even physical processes. The mind is not just a passive observer, it's an active projector, sending predictions to the world before it even receives signals from it. This means that often, we are not seeing in order to then understand. We are understanding in order to then see. This reversal changes everything, and that's where we're headed. Because if the mind is a silent creator of what we call reality, the question is no longer what exists out there, but what am I willing to let exist in here so that the world can show it to me? Modern science has revealed something deeply unsettling. The act of observing is not only passive, it is creative. For a long time, it was believed that the senses captured information from the external world, sent it to the brain, and then the mind simply interpreted it. But recent research in neuroscience and physics shows that this process is largely inverted. The brain predicts what it will see, hear, or feel before sensory signals even arrive. This mechanism is known as predictive processing. It starts from a simple and disturbing idea. The mind doesn't wait to receive reality in order to understand it. It anticipates reality and then adjusts what comes in to align with that prediction. It's as if we're watching a film whose script is already partially written in our heads, and the information from the world only confirms or corrects small parts. Imagine walking down a familiar street. Your brain already holds a map of this scene, where the shops are, what kind of light there is, the expected sounds. When something enters your perception, it compares the sensory input to this map and decides whether to confirm or alter what it believed was there. Most impressively, it often keeps its initial version, even when faced with conflicting information. This explains why we might not notice obvious changes or unusual details. They simply don't fit the dominant prediction. In quantum physics, this creative capacity of observation takes on another dimension. The so-called observer effect shows that the act of measuring or observing a particle can influence its state. Although this phenomenon is often misinterpreted, its core is clear. Reality, at its most fundamental level, is not completely defined until it is measured. This doesn't mean human consciousness creates particles from nothing, but it does suggest that the way something is observed actively participates in what it becomes. When we combine these two perspectives, the neuroscientific and the quantum, the picture that emerges is radical. We do not passively receive reality. We project expectations, shape possibilities, and adjust perceptions so they match our internal models. The world we experience is, to a large extent, a meeting point between what is out there and what we already carry in here. This notion echoes ancient concepts from spirituality, which for millennia have claimed that perception creates worlds. Contemplative texts from different traditions speak of seeing with the heart, looking with the soul, or listening with the spirit, metaphors that today can be translated in scientific terms as the alignment between internal states and the information we choose to confirm in the environment. A common example of this interaction between prediction and perception is facial recognition. Studies show that when we see a blurred or partially covered face, the brain automatically fills in the gaps based on memories of known faces. This is an evolutionary advantage. Quickly identifying an ally or enemy can be vital, but it's also a trap, as we can see intentions, expressions, or emotions that weren't really there, simply because our mind expected to find them. The same happens on larger scales. When we believe the world is hostile, our perceptual systems will be more alert to signs of threat and less receptive to signs of safety or beauty. The reverse is also true. If we expect to find harmony and cooperation, our filters will tend to highlight elements that confirm this view. Neuroscience calls this perceptual confirmation bias, and it's one of the invisible engines behind the subjective realities each of us inhabits. In practice, this means we do not all live in the same world. We live in personal versions of it, shaped by our predictions. That's why two people can witness the same event and describe it so differently. It's not just a matter of opinion. They truly saw different things because their minds projected different reference frames. Understanding this scientific basis does not diminish the magic of the phenomenon. On the contrary, it amplifies the responsibility we have for what we experience. If our observation takes part in creating what we see, every moment becomes a point of choice. We can continue operating on autopilot, confirming old predictions and reinforcing old patterns, or we can alter the predictions, expanding the palette of possible realities. This is the bridge between science and spirituality. It's not just about believing that we are co-creators, but about understanding that our perceptual system already operates as such, whether we're aware of it or not. The remaining question is not whether we are shaping reality, but whether we will do it intentionally. And here, more than anywhere else, observation ceases to be an act of seeing and becomes an act of creating. We usually think of perception as a process that happens only in the mind, but the entire body takes part in this act. Every physiological state alters the way we observe, even if we're not aware of it. It's as if the body were an invisible lens, sharpening or distorting the focus of our perception according to the internal chemistry of the moment. When we're anxious, for example, the sympathetic nervous system goes on alert, amplifying threat signals and reducing sensitivity to subtle stimuli. Vision tends to narrow, hearing focuses on abrupt sounds, and even touch becomes more reactive. In this state, we don't see the world as it is. We see the world as someone on alert would see it. The landscape is filtered to confirm the urgency the body already feels. The opposite is also true. In states of deep calm, when the parasympathetic nervous system takes over, perception expands, sounds seem sharper, colors more vivid, time seems to slow down. This isn't just a subjective sensation. The body is truly modulating how the brain processes sensory inputs. This plasticity shows that observing is not just a mental function, but an integrated experience of body, emotion, and consciousness. Emotions, in turn, are like frequencies that adjust the spectrum of what we can perceive. Gratitude, for example, creates space to notice small expressions of beauty and harmony in daily life. Anger, on the other hand, tends to reduce attention to nuances and focus on contrasts, conflicts, and imperfections. This doesn't mean that one emotion is good and the other bad, but that each one tunes perception to a different set of information. There's a physiological explanation for this. Emotions are accompanied by hormonal changes and shifts in the brain's electrical activity. The release of cortisol in moments of stress, for example, prepares the body for quick action, but reduces the ability to process complex or subtle information. Neurotransmitters associated with pleasure and calm, like serotonin, tend to favor a broader, more receptive perception. When we understand this connection, it becomes clear that the quality of our observation depends as much on emotional regulation as on mental focus. Observing consciously, therefore, is not just a matter of paying attention, but of aligning body and mind in a state capable of receiving reality in a more open and less distorted way. Many spiritual masters throughout history have emphasized bodily practices as part of the path to awareness. Meditation, deep breathing, internal martial arts, singing, dancing. All these practices have a direct effect on physiology and therefore on the perceptual lens. They are not mere symbolic rituals. They act on the biological level, reconfiguring how the world is registered by the senses. Think, for example, of a situation where you are extremely hungry. Attention is hijacked by any stimulus related to food. Smells, images, and sounds linked to eating gain immediate prominence. The whole body is sending signals to the brain to prioritize that type of information. Now imagine that, at that same moment, someone tries to show you a magnificent sunset. It may be objectively beautiful, but it will likely go unnoticed. Not because you're incapable of appreciating it, but because your physiological lens is calibrated to another priority. This example shows that our perception is not democratic. It privileges what resonates with the internal state. It's like tuning a radio station. If the dial is set to a specific frequency, it doesn't matter how many other songs are playing. You'll only hear the one that matches the current tuning. The good news is that this tuning can be changed. By altering the physiological state, we change how the world presents itself. Simple techniques such as conscious breathing, slow stretching, or even drinking water mindfully can reorient the body to a more receptive state. And in this new state, it becomes possible to notice aspects of reality that were previously invisible. The crucial point is that there is no pure perception separate from the body. Even the most abstract thoughts are shaped by heartbeats, breathing patterns, muscle tension, and the chemistry flowing through the blood. Ignoring this is like trying to photograph a landscape without realizing the camera lens is fogged or scratched. Recognizing the body as part of observation is a step toward taking more conscious control of the experience. It's not about trying to eliminate emotions or sensations, but about understanding them as dynamic filters. And through understanding, choosing which internal state to cultivate so that the reality revealed is the one we truly want to find. Thus, the act of seeing ceases to be merely a sensory function and becomes a dance between what is outside and what pulses within. It is in this dance that reality, as we live it, takes shape. Our way of perceiving the world is not an accident. It is the result of millions of years of adaptation. From the first organisms capable of detecting light or vibration, evolution has shaped the senses not to reveal absolute truth, but to ensure survival. What we see, hear, and feel is, to a large extent, a reduced and filtered version of reality, enough to guide our actions in the environment, but far from encompassing everything that exists. In nature, this selection has a clear purpose: to spend energy only on what increases the chances of living and reproducing. Nocturnal animals, for example, see much better in low light conditions, but don't distinguish colors as we do. The eagle has such sharp vision that it can detect movement from kilometers away, but it doesn't perceive certain details that, to us, would be obvious. Each species carries a window of perception shaped by specific needs, and we humans are no exception. This means that the reality we access is conditioned by the adaptive design that brought us here. Human perception prioritizes faces, movement patterns, speech sounds, and immediate danger signals. The rest, the majority of what exists, remains as an indistinct background. Modern physics, however, reminds us that this background is not empty. It is a vibrant field of possibilities, invisible to our common senses. It is here that the quantum perspective expands the conversation. At the subatomic level, matter does not behave like fixed, defined objects, but like probabilities in constant mutation. Particles can exist in multiple states until a measurement defines them. And measurement in this context is not just passive recording. It is an act that collapses possibilities into a concrete result. When we combine this with the understanding that our senses and our brain filter and reorganize information, the conclusion is inevitable. Each observer accesses a specific fraction of reality, and this fraction is shaped not only by their biology, but by their internal state and intention. Quantum physics does not claim that we create the universe in an absolute sense, but it makes clear that the way we interact with it directly influences what manifests for us. This idea echoes ancient spiritual traditions that speak of multiple worlds coexisting, each accessible at different levels of consciousness. For science, this can be described as possible states that only actualize when a specific observation selects them. For human experience, it means that changing the way we observe can literally change the reality that becomes available. Consider this: if evolution has trained us to notice primarily threats, rapid changes, and social signals, and if physics says that the universe contains infinite other possible information, then most of us live in a narrow corridor of perception. We may go through an entire lifetime interacting only with a small slice of the real, never realizing there are open doors to radically different experiences. This limitation is not only sensory, but cognitive. The brain, in the effort for efficiency, maintains stable internal models of how the world works and filters out any data that doesn't fit them. The result is that we rarely perceive anything that contradicts our deepest expectations. This is useful for maintaining coherence, but it can trap us in repetitive versions of reality. What makes this reflection urgent is that we do, in fact, have some degree of choice. By altering our intentions, expanding our states of attention, and making space for the unexpected, we can tune in to different aspects of the world. It's as if reality were a vast quantum field, and we, selective antennas, could turn the dial to pick up other frequencies. This change in tuning doesn't require advanced technology or superhuman abilities. It begins with recognizing that observation is not a passive mirror, but an act of creative participation. Quantum physics reminds us that the observer is always implicated in the phenomenon. Biology shows us that our senses have been shaped by specific purposes, and consciousness offers us the possibility of transcending, at least in part, these inherited limitations. When we connect these points, perception ceases to be a fixed given and becomes a malleable territory. We can continue living in the narrow corridor adaptation has given us, or we can explore the wider field of possibilities. This choice, although it doesn't change all the rules of the universe, does change the universe we can experience. In the end, perhaps the question is not whether there is an untouched objective reality, but how many potential realities are waiting to be revealed by the way we choose to look. And in this sense, physics and spirituality meet. Both point to a world that is not entirely given, but that reveals itself in direct proportion to our openness to it. If everything you see is shaped by the way you observe, then every moment is a silent opportunity for creation. We are not prisoners of a distorted reflection, but artisans of entire worlds. The real is not only out there waiting to be discovered, it pulses at the intersection between what exists and what we allow to exist through our attention. To observe consciously is more than to contemplate. It is to choose with the delicacy of someone who knows that every perceived detail reorganizes the fabric of the possible. The next sunrise, the next conversation, the next silence, all are ready to become something different if you change the way you look at them. And now, knowing this, the question that remains is, what world will you create today? If you've made it this far, write in the comments, "I choose to see differently."